Am I okay. Am I audible to you, Chinmay? Okay. So now uh, our discussion will be on the importance of poetry itself. You know very well that how for the last several decades it is fiction which has dominated Indian English literature. It is fiction which has dominated Indian English literature. But today our focus will be on the importance of poetry itself. Why should we read poetry? Say, for example, the spectacular success of novelists like your Bikram Seth, Arundhati Roy is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. The the reason being fiction sells better than poetry. Many people read fictions and books of fiction are sold in plenty. So Indian English poetry is much less studied than fiction. In other words, you can say poetry has fared, fared badly in the century the world over. And besides the inherent value of poetry, we also need to bear in mind that for nearly the first 100 years of its existence, it is poetry that has led Indian English literature. And its first writers were mostly poets. And fiction didn't really emerge as a serious literary genre till 1930s. Or to sum up, we can say Indian English poetry has a special importance both for literary and extra literary reasons, you can say. The extra literary reasons are, you can say, for example, are ideological, political, historical, social, and cultural. So, far as the literary reasons are concerned, the literary reasons have to do with both the intrinsic value of poetry and the historical importance of the present day. Today we shall discuss some of the great poets of India and their contributions to Indian English poetry. And, and in the very first phase, we come across two Indian English poets, and they are very important poets. And here we shall briefly discuss the biographical sketches of those two poets like Henry Dereggio and Tarudatta. Henry Dereggio and Tarudatta, followed by an overview of the poetry. When you talk about Henry Dereggio was an Anglo-Indian, right? Born of a born of a Portuguese father and English mother. He received education uh, at a place at an academy called David Drummond's Academy. David Drummond's Academy at the age of 14. And afterwards, he worked for years as an accountant in a mercantile firm before he was sent by his father to his uncle's house in Bhagalpur. Um, there, Derezio gathered almost experiences which entered into Fakira Jangira, his long narrative poem, which was published in 1828. The Fakir of Jangira, Faqueer, the Fakir of Jangira, Junghera. This is a very long narrative poem about, you can see, the rescue of a would-be Sati, right, among other things. Even by the time, say for example, at the age of 16, Henry Derezio was contributing to the Indian Gazette. At the age of 18, way back in 1827, his first collection of poems was published. And this made him famous, right, in the small literary circle of Calcutta. And he began to work as the assistant editor of the Indian Gazette. Also, he was contributing regularly to the Bengal Annual, the Calcutta Magazine, the Kaleidoscope, and the Indian Magazine. These are the different magazines to which he used to contribute articles. A few months later, at the age of 20, he started his own paper known as Calcutta Gazette, of which he was both the editor and the chief contributor. Um, if you should discuss Derezio's poetry, he published, as I said, two volumes of verse, two volumes of poems. First is poems published in 1827 and the Fakir of Jangira, the metrical tale and other poems, which was also published in 1828. Most of these poems uh, today appear either half finished or juvenile. Uh, say, for example, had he lived, so he died very young. Had he lived even for another 8 years, right, or 9 years, as John Keats did, perhaps he might have had many more poems of higher quality and maturity. He died very young. Even John Keats had also died very young. But had he lived for another 8 to 9 years, he might have had many more poems of higher maturity, higher quality. Uh, Henry Derezio's poem, The Fakir of Jangira, is a long poem. It is about Nulini. It is about Nulini, a high caste Hindu widow who is about to be burned on the funeral pyre of her husband. A robber or a chieftain rescues her from becoming a forced sati. The story is rather, you can say, romantic and is narrated in rhythmic lines in iambic tetrameter. It is in the shorter poems that Henry Dereggio's forte as a poet lies, and many of these shorter poems are sonnets with somewhat you can say unconventional rhyme schemes. And M.K. Naik, a great critic, comments on Henry Dereggio's poems. He says that the sonnets of Henry Dereggio bears a strong impress at British romantic poetry, especially that of Lord Byron. In any case, you can say several features of romanticism are easily found in his poetry. And so, for example, when you talk about the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 to approximately 1830s, Romanticism, if we were to consider William Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1800, right? He emphasized on common language. William Wordsworth emphasized on common language and materials taken from common life. The language of William Wordsworth is very common, and the material that he had taken is from very common life as fit for his poetry. And when Preface to Lyrical Ballads was written by William Wordsworth, it also emphasized emotions and authentic feelings, emotions and feelings. It didn't have artificiality of thought and diction. There is nothing artificiality in the poetry of William Wordsworth. And it always looked to nature for inspiration and used organic, right, as opposed to the mechanical models of poetic structure. And Wordsworthian poetry was strongly autobiographical and explored the whole range of subjective experiences which was excluded from poetry. Do you get it, Chinmoy? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Am I audible? I'm talk.
Yes,
I am
sir.
talking about the poetry of Henry Dereggio and comparing it with the poetry of William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth, again, let me tell you, William Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads was published in 1800, and it always emphasized common language. It always emphasized on materials taken from common life. Language is very simple. Theme is common life, and that was considered to be fit for poetry. And this poetry of William Wordsworth also emphasized on emotion and feeling. It never gave thrust, it never gave importance to the artificiality of thought and diction. There was nothing artificiality in the poetry of William Wordsworth. It always looked to nature for some kind of inspiration. And the poetry of William Wordsworth is strongly autobiographical. And it was, you can say, expressive, idealistic, and sometimes the poetry of William Wordsworth is prophetic. It preaches something. What is for us more interesting for our purpose is that Derrigio, right, and Derrigio's poems. No contemporary Indian poet, right, has a single poem about India as a nation. And Bengali poets of his time, for example, were not writing in the tradition of Sakta and Vaishnava Bhakti about the relationship between the human and the divine. Michael Madhusudan Datta, Bengal's first modern poet, even follows Henry Dereju by a quarter of a century. And Michael Madhusudan Datta too is not known for any nationalist poems. So two poems of Henry Dereju have been taken for discussion over here. And the two poems of Dereju, both of them are sonnets. What do you mean by sonnet? Sonnet is a poem of 14 lines. The first 8 lines of the sonnet are known as octave part. The next 6 lines of the poem are called sestet part, and it follows a particular rhyme scheme. So, when you talk about sonnets, and Henry Dereju during those days had written poems in the form of sonnets, and these two poems qualified to be considered nationalists. One poem is The Harp of India, the second poem is To India, My Native Land. The Harp of India, second poem is To India, My Native Land. The, in the poem The Harp of India, the poet himself calls it Harp of My Country. Clearly, their reference is not just to a poetic tradition, but to the enterprise of an entire civilization. Henry Dereju's poem is suffused with the sense of lost glory, the sense of lost glory. and the consciousness of decline of a culture. Let me just quote a few lines from the text of the poem, the few lines from the poem The Harp of India. Say, for example, the withered bough, quote unquote, the unstrung harp, the ruined monument, the cold hands of the dead kings. These are all images. And these images suggest the sorry fate of the country, the sorry condition of the country at present. Yet, the poet is not without hopes. He is optimistic. The poet is optimistic. In other words, you can say, if the divine notes of the heart can be revived once again, he wishes to strike the first note. The poem ends with the hope of renewal. So the poem is optimistic. The poet is optimistic. The poem ends with the hope of renewal. And Henry Dereggio is aware of his being a front runner, right? An ideal in this process. The second poem, the theme, or the themes of the facts of decline, the possibilities of renewal, right? And the poets Henry Dereggio's role in it recur in the other sonnet, known as To India, My Native Land. Here, the ideology of nationalism, the theme of nationalism, is quite direct and unambiguous. If you talk about um, I mean, the complexities of Derecho's own racial, social, and cultural position, right? Combined with the uncertainty of the times in which he lived, makes it difficult to decline his place easily. Mm, because the polarity between the colonizers and the colonized was itself not so just during times. It would be unjust to attempt a fix him in that grade. What is clear is that Henry Dereggio was not part of the traditional India of, you can say, Sanskrit and Persian, nor was he a part of the vernacular India of Bengali or Hindi. Yet it is very clear that he was not a part of British India, though he was related to it because of the language he wrote in, because his racial status debarred him from higher government jobs. So these two poems of Henry Dereggio speaks of his nationalistic fervor and zeal. When you talk about Tarudatta and her poems, Tarudatta, like Henry Dereggio, also died very young. She died of tuberculosis, TB. Born in 1856 in a well-known westernized family in Calcutta, Tarudatta had the advantages, had the privileges of good education and happy family environment. Good education and good family environment, happy family environment. These two factors, good, she had very good education and she had also a happy family environment. These two factors played a very crucial role in her artistic development. Gobind Chandra Datta, Gobind Chandra Datta, father of Taru Datta, was a well-to-do Bengali gentleman and given to literary pursuits. And some of his poems were included in an extraordinary family anthology of Indian English poems titled The Datta Family Album. The Datta Family Album, which was published in 1870. This was a collection of almost 187 poems by three Datta brothers, Govind Chandra Datta, Hari Chandra Datta, and Girish Chandra Datta, a cousin of Umesh. They had written almost 187 poems in English. In 1862, Tarudatta was born in 1856 when she was just six years old. When Tarudatta was 6 years old, that means in 1862, the entire family, Datta family, embraced Christianity. They were Hindus, but they were converted to Christianity. And this led to a temporary estrangement between Taru's parents, the mother finding it difficult to leave her ancestral religion. Mother was herself. She became a very strong Christian. And this act of conversion to Christianity, right, is one of the is of great importance when we try to understand the cultural history of modern India. It was during this time that most people used to be converted. And this act of conversion of the Datta family into Christianity is of great importance. When we try to understand the cultural history of modern India, many upper caste Hindus converted to Christianity during this period of reform and revival, you can say. And their motivations had a different ground, right? Let us not discuss all these things, why people used to be converted during those days, but how this, Tarudatta latter became a poet. That is the point of discussion. Tarudatta may be credited with being the first Indian English poet to use English myths. Sorry, to use Indian myths. Though her family was converted to Christianity, but she never forgot Indian culture, Indian ethos, Indian social life. And it is she, it is Tarudatta, who may be credited with being the first Indian English poet, right, to use Indian myths very extensively. Of course, her Christianity, her conversion to Christianity and her Christianity itself surfaces in her renderings, in her writings. But by and large, you can say it is as a sympathetic insider to Indian culture that she writes. Uh, Tarudatta and her siblings, brother and sister, say brother Abzu, right, and other sisters used to write poems. Where let us not talk more much about others, but we can devote some time to Tarudatta's writing career. Tarudatta turned her attention. Right? She turned her attention to literary ambitions. She wanted to be a poet. And in 1875, he was born in 1856. In 1875, Tarudatta published a sea gleamed in French fields, quote unquote, largely a rendering of French words into English. French words into English. The book at that time was well received in India. It was well recognized in India and found its way to London. By now, Tarudatta had begun to learn Sanskrit, and within a year, she was so proficient in the language as to begin composing English poems based on the stories she had read in Sanskrit. And after her death, I mean, these poems were collected posthumously as ancient ballads and legends of Hindustan, quote unquote, which was published in 1882. This book was published posthumously after her death because Tarudatta died in 1877. She was born in 1856, died in 1870. So young, she died so young. And before that, she had finished a French novel. She had also left an unfinished novel in English called Bayanka, or the young Spanish maiden, quote unquote. And this manuscript was later published in the Bengal magazine in 1878, again after her death. Again, the same thing we find in Tarudatta's poems, the theme of nationalism. The rise of nationalism in India is a complex phenomenon, and a very uh, important dimension to it is that of politics of cultural identity. It is in that politics that poets like Tarudatta, right, Ramachandra Datta, right, made an important contributions to English poetry. Though neither wrote poems to or about contemporary India as Henry Dereggio did, both Ramachandra Datta and Tarudatta attempted to validate the present by supplying its past. Tarudatta's, as I said, Tarudatta's Unseen Ballads and Legends of Hinduism, which was published posthumously, which was published after her death, is an example of translation of ancient myths into the late 19th century Indian English. Some of her poems, one uh, are prescribed for study. One is Sita, second is Lotus, the Lotus, and the third poem is our Kaswarina tree. Three poems have been discussed, but uh, when you look at the poems of Tarudatta, uh, you'll find that she exemplifies in the context of the rise of Indian nationalism, a search for cultural identity. Simultaneously, or at the same time, we can say, her own Christian beliefs, her own Christian beliefs make her aware of a very complex relationship with traditional India. Her very Indian themes, right, force a new Indian identity, which can say, resist, which can withstand colonial aggression. His poems, Sita, as I said, The Lotus, or Kaswarina Tree, are poems of memory, are poems of cultural affiliation, are poems of the power of imagination to heal sorrow. Sorry. The way these poems, either it is Sita or the Lotus or our Kaswarina tree, all these poems are superbly crafted, very well designed. Poems are designed in such a way that she organizes individual stanzas, phrases, rhythm and music. And he almost juxtaposes, places all these things, stanzas, phrases, rhythms, music, right? Places one against the other with her own ideas. Both, we can say both Dereggio and Tarudatta, because of their racial status, uh, in case of Dereggio, and Christian beliefs in case of Tarudatta, they have not found a firm footing on the vortex of Indian English literature. But their strong nationalist strains have kept the debate of the place alive, and their contributions to Indian English poetry is immense. The next writers, the next poets who are placed here for discussion are your Sri Aurobindo and Sarojini Naidu. In my previous lecture, I had introduced Sri Aurobindo. He's just not a poet. He's a great freedom fighter. He's a great seer. He's a great saint. He's a great sage. When you talk about Sri Aurobindo and Sarojini Naidu, right? Both were leaders of modern India. We shall try to appreciate their overall contributions to our country, to our literature, before focusing on individual points. As I said earlier, Sri Aurobindo Ghosh is a multifaceted genius. He's a multifaceted genius. Some of the poems of Sri Aurobindo and your Sarojini Naidu have been um, introduced to you. Before that, we can focus a little more time on Sri Aurobindo's complete works. Sri Aurobindo's complete works were collected and even edited in the 30-volume Sri Aurobindo Birth Centenary Library. 30 volume. Uh, Out of these, the following are collections of poems written originally English and some are incomplete poems. Say, for example, Songs to Mirtila, which was published in 1925. Initially, it was published in 1895. Initially, it was published in 1895, and then it was reprinted in 1925 after 30 years. Songs to Mirtila. Urbasi, a poem. It was published in 1896. Baji Prabhu, 1910. Chitrangada, 1910. This remains incomplete. Chitrangada is a book of poem which remain incomplete. Ahan and other poems, Love and Death, quote unquote, published in the 1921. Six poems of Sri Aurobindo, 1934. Again, poems, 1941. Collected poems and plays, 1942. So many collections. And the most important book of poem is Savitri. It was published in 1954, and I had talked to you regarding this voluminous book called Savitri. Uh, a tree is a poem. A tree is a poem, and another is Life and Death. The third one is called Bride of Fire. Tree is one of the early poems of Sri Aurobindo. It is only 6 lines long, just 6 lines long with 2 stanzas poem. The first is a quatrain with a rhyme scheme of AB, AB, followed by a couplet, 6 lines only, followed by a couplet. Couplet is a 2 line. It appears to be very simple. The poem tree appears to be very simple, but it contains the essence of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, the quintessence of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Tree poem. What does the poem say? What does the tree poem say? It says that a tree stretches its branches, spreads its branches heavenwards. A tree stretches its branches heavenwards. It is earthbound, heaven bound, heaven amorous, and it is fixed to the ground. The tree is fixed to the ground with its root on the soil. It actually reaches upwards towards the skies. And the couplet, the last 2 lines of the poem, drives home the significance of the image. What is the image? The human soul is just like this tree. The human soul is just like this tree. And our body and brain are grounded. So are they, no? That they detain our heavenly flight. How philosophic the poem is. Well, the tree is seen in positive terms, in terms of its aspiration, whereas the human being like us is seen somewhat negatively. His body and brain detaining his upward rise. Unlike the tree, the human being is almost being blamed for his urge to remain limited, to remain bound. So, in that sense, you can say this poem contains the seed of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Because sometimes we have read in the teachings of Sri Aurobindo that Sri Aurobindo sees us as divided beings. One part of us happy with our present attainments, another thirsting for higher things. And that has been presented in the poem called Tree. The next poem written by Sri Aurobindo is known as The Life and Death. This is also a short poem with a structure that is similar to a tree. Structure remains almost the same. You have a quatrain and a couplet, but the latter is not separated from the former. Here, the quatrain is not separated from the couplet, and the rhyme scheme is almost similar, like that of a tree. I mean, A B A B C C. The poem consists of 6 lines. The first 4 lines There's a quatrain and then it follows a couplet. And here also, Sriravindra tries to attempt to reconcile two opposites, in this case, life and death, just as the title of the poem itself says. Sriravindra says that the two have been regarded as antinomies for the ages, life and death, thus shaping our thought. But now he has access to new wisdom. He has ways to achieve new wisdom, as it were, like quote unquote, long hidden pages are opened, liberating truths undreamed. Well, what is this hidden truth that Sri Aurobindo has discovered? What is this hidden truth that Sri Aurobindo discovered in this poem Life and Death? And Sri Aurobindo asserts in this poem that there is no death at all. Everything is only life. How optimistic he is. There is no death at all. Everything is only life. And then he qualifies a little by admitting that if there is death at all, if there is death at all, it is merely life disgusted. Life itself is considered as death. So this is the second poem. Similarly, he has talked about the bride of fire. Even the golden light. Golden light is a very remarkable poem. This is sonnet which he wrote during his poetic career. No other poet in the English language attempted a sonnet series on spiritual topics. Naturally, sonnet is written on love themes. But since Sri Aurobindo used to write on spiritual topics, he wrote the golden light, hmm, and this is in the form of a sonnet. Sonnet is normally a 13-line poem. The main theme of sonnet is love. Right? Here it is in the spiritual topic. So Sri Aurobindo's series is unique. Each sonnet is a brief but clear description. Almost each sonnet is very clear, uh, brief and clear description of what you can say the spiritual state, spiritual experience, or description the spiritual mood. The present poem, the present sonnet, is Shakespearean sonnet in structure, consisting of three quatrains, followed by a couplet. Right? And in this poem, we find the culmination is the whole of the earth becoming the divine's play. Since it is a spiritual theme, you will find um, that the culmination is the whole of the earth becoming the divine's play field after the transformation of the physical. Once again, he compares this with the golden light. If you talk about Sarojini Naidu and a brief biographical sketch, she was born in 1879 in Hyderabad. Her parents were Dr. say Aghorenath Chattopadhyay and mother Barada Sundari Devi. And she was the eldest of several children, of which eight only survived. Right? Um, Aghorenath, I mean the father of Sarojin Naidu, is a DSc, Doctor of Science from Edinburgh. He had been excommunicated from his caste for his radical views. His wife, as I said, Barada Sundari Devi, had to be schooled in Brahmo Sabhas or women during his absence. And on his return, Aghorenath took up service with the Nizam of Hyderabad. He not only founded the modern system of education in Hyderabad, but was well known as a reformer, a great thinker, and a scientist. Right? Sarojini was a child who began composing poetry even at an early age. When he was a small child, he started writing poetry. She passed the Madras matriculation examination when she was 13 years old. At 14, she fell in love with a person called Dr. M. Govindaraju Naidu at the age of 14. At the age of 13, she passed her matriculation. Who and Dr. M. Govindaraju Naidu was a widower, 9 years senior, besides being from a different caste. So perhaps fearing for the future of his daughter, her father, Aghorenath, arranged to send her to England on a scholarship from the Nizam of Hyderabad. And she stayed in England from 1895 to 1898 for 3 years, of which out of these 3 years, she spent over 2 years at Girton College, Cambridge. And that environment didn't suit her. She failed to make a mark in her studies, in even sports, but instead got to know some of the leading English poets of her time. And Edmund Gosset became her patron and encouraged her to write. And she returned to India in 1898 to marry her beau boyfriend, Dr. Naidu, Govindarajulu Naidu. And this marriage, the marriage caused a sensation and was solemnized in a Brahmo ceremony under the provisions of special marriage acts. And thereafter, she had four children in quick succession, but she couldn't be happy, she couldn't be contented with the life of a housewife. She plunged into public life and public service, publishing her poems alongside her other activities. She became an important member of the Congress party, as you know, influenced by the first, I mean, Gopal Krishna Gokhale and then by Mahatma Gandhi. She became one of the best known freedom fighters, Sarojini Naidu. And she traveled widely, both in India and overseas, as a spokesperson for the Congress and for the cause of India. And by the time she is already a famous poet, right? And at the same time, she was one of the front ranking leaders of the Congress party at the time. And she was the first Indian woman She was the first Indian woman to become the president of Congress in 1925 and also served the president of All India Women's Committee. She was even jailed 4 times during the struggle for freedom and became the first woman governor of India's largest state, United Province. Now it is called as Uttar Pradesh after independence. So, in a nutshell, you can say Sarojini Naidu was one of the most talented, most visible, colorful, dynamic Indian women of the country. When you talk about the poetic career of Sarojini Naidu, it just began, as I said, when she was just 11 years old. When Sarojini Naidu was just 11 years old, she started her poetic career. Uh, the early works that she had written during those days, there is a long poem, Lady of the Lake. It is a long poem. And it was actually published as Mehir Munir, a poem in 3 cantos by a Brahmin girl in 1893 when Sarojini Naidu was just 14 years old. Her next collection, Sarojini Naidu's next collection, Songs by S. Chattopadhyay, was printed privately by her father, Aghorinath Chattopadhyay, in Hyderabad in 1896. And this contains poems which she wrote between 1892 to 1896. And during this period, she was actually sent to England, and this collection was published when she was in England. Some of her poems found their way into songs, quote unquote, along with a number of older pieces. In fact, this collection is the weakest of all her books, songs, weakest of all her collections. Um, the selected poetry and prose of Sarojini Naidu is perhaps one of her collections, and the publication of songs um, was not supervised by her, though the printed copies of both Mehir Munir and songs, quote unquote, so correction marks in her own handwriting. Perhaps she intended to publish both these two books of poems called Songs Mehir Munir sometime later, but then she dropped the idea of doing it. So, mm, she has, it was with golden threshold. It was with golden threshold, quote unquote, which was published in 1905, that Sarojini Naidu's career as a poet really took off. He became known, she became known, famous with the publication of the book called The Golden Threshold in 1905. And at that time, Arthur Symons was responsible for the publication of this book. And the poems in it belong almost to two periods. It is a period from 1896 and 1904. Mm, See, I mean, almost all our poems were reviewed both in India and outside India, and all the poems are well acclaimed both nationally and internationally. She had her third collection, known as the name of the book is The Broken Wing. The Broken Wing. And that book was published in 1917. And there was also a considerable criticism of her limitations as a poet. And by that time, by 1917 or 20, the first wave of modernism was beginning to gather momentum in Europe. And there was about to be a change in poetic fashion. And Sarojini Naidu was swept aside by this tide. In Europe, so many prominent figures, personalities, poets, right, used to write by the time. And as an Indian, she was swept aside by this time. And she never published another collection in her lifetime. And another book called The Feather of the Dawn was published in 1961. It was published by Padmaja Publications. And modernism was the ruling mode in Indian poetry by that time. The book was penned by Nissim Esquire, among others. Sarojini had been all but consigned to poetic oblivion. So you can say when you talk about the poetic graph of Sarojini Naidu, this the graph of her career shows that her reputation was at its peak, was at its highest from 1905 to 1917 and then declined afterwards. But in India, in our country, she continued to have a readership, falling until her death. In the 1950s, when modernism became the dominant mode of Indian English poetry, her reputation as a poet still was at its lowest. And this contempt, this loathing for her poetry persists in an entire generation of poets and critics who are now in their 50s or you can say at their 60s. Perhaps this time, this is the time is now ripe for reinterpretation, not if not the revival of her poetry. Um, some of her poems like Love and Death, The Old Oman, right? Love and Death is a sonnet taken from the collection of poems called The Bard of Time. Love and Death is a sonnet taken from the book of poems called The Bard of Poems. And this can be rated as one of Sarojini's best or finest poems. As I said, this is a sonnet and it is in the form of a Petrarchan sonnet. And it follows the rhyme scheme known as ABBA, ABBA, CCDEED. This is the rhyme scheme. ABBA, ABBA, C C D E E D. This is a Petrarchan sonnet form, and with this having this rhyme scheme pattern.
Sir, ଏଇ ଯୋଉ
The first,
କହୁଛନ୍ତି A B B A, what do you meaning, sir?
it means the first line, right, rhymes with, you first write down this scheme, a rhyming scheme, then I will explain to you. A, B, B, A means first line rhymes with the fourth line. Second line of the poem rhymes with the third line, right? Again, fifth line rhymes with the eighth line. Sixth line rhymes with the seventh line. The first eight lines, the octave part, right, rhymes like this: A B B A, A B B A, C C D E E D. Got it? କବିତାର ମନେକର କବିତାଟି 14 ଲାଇନର କବିତାଟି ବୁଝିହେଲା। ପ୍ରଥମ 8 ଲାଇନକୁ କହନ୍ତି ଅକ୍ଟେଭ ପାର୍ଟ, OCTAV। ନେକ୍ସଟ 6 ଲାଇନକୁ କହନ୍ତି ସେଷ୍ଟେଡ ପାର୍ଟ, SESTET। କ୍ଲିୟର? ଏବଂ ସିନ୍ସ ଇଟ୍ ଇଜ ଏ ସନେଟ, ଓକେ, ଏବଂ ପେଟ୍ରାର୍କନ ସନେଟ ମଡେଲରେ ଲେଖା ଯାଇଛି, ତାର ରାଇମ ସ୍କିମ୍ ହଉଛି A B B A, A B B A। This is the octave part, ପ୍ରଥମ 8 ଲାଇନ। Next 6 lines, sestet part,
Sir,
C C
first
D
line
E
O,
E।
sir जो
Yes,
octave part कहते O C T कौन कहले start है 8 lines टा
OCTAVE, OCTAV, octave। The first 8 lines of the poem is known as the octave part. The next 6 lines of the poem is known as sestet, 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 sestet. And this sonnet follows the sonneteer Petrarch, Italian sonneteer. And since this has been written in the Petrarchan model, it has a rhyme scheme known as ABBA, ABBA, CCDEED. Clear?
yes sir
Achha, do you have been provided with books or not?
yes sir
Hmm? ବହି ପାଖରେ ଅଛି ନା ନାଇଁ ନାଇଁ? ପରୀକ୍ଷା କେମିତି ଦବ ଆଗକୁ ଏଇସବୁ ଜିନିଷ ଗୁଡା ଜାଣିନ? ଇଏ ଗୋଟେ ହଉଛି 14 ଲାଇନର କବିତା କଥା। କବିତାର ଶୀର୍ଷକ ହଉଛି ଲଭ୍ ଆଣ୍ଡ ଡେଥ୍। ହେଲା? ପ୍ରଥମ 8 ଲାଇନକୁ ଅକ୍ଟେଭ ପାର୍ଟ କୁହାଯାଏ। ନେକ୍ସଟ 6 ଲାଇନକୁ ସେଷ୍ଟେଡ ପାର୍ଟ କୁହାଯାଏ। ପ୍ରଥମ ଯୋଉ 8 ଲାଇନ ତାର ଯତିପାତରେ କେମିତି? ପ୍ରଥମ ଲାଇନ ସହିତ ଚତୁର୍ଥ ଲାଇନ ଆଉ ପଞ୍ଚମ ଲାଇନ ଯତିପାତ ହଉଛି। କ୍ଲିୟର? ସେକେଣ୍ଡ ଲାଇନ ସହିତ ଥାର୍ଡ ଲାଇନ ଯତିପାତ ହଉଛି। ହେଲା? ଷଷ୍ଠ ଲାଇନ ସହିତ ସପ୍ତମ ଲାଇନ ଯତିପାତ ହଉଛି। ଚତୁର୍ଥ ଲାଇନ ସହିତ ଅଷ୍ଟମ ଲାଇନ, ଏ ପଞ୍ଚମ ଲାଇନ ସହିତ ଅଷ୍ଟମ ଲାଇନ ଯତିପାତ ହଉଛି। ତାପରେ ସେଷ୍ଟେଡ ପାର୍ଟରେ ପ୍ରଥମ ଦିଟା ଲାଇନ ଯତିପାତ, ତାପରେ ତୃତୀୟ ଲାଇନଟା ଷଷ୍ଠ ଲାଇନ ସହିତ ଯତିପାତ ହଉଛି, ଚତୁର୍ଥ ଲାଇନ ପଞ୍ଚମ ଲାଇନ ସହିତ ଯତିପାତ ହଉଛି। Clear? Okay. So this octave part of the poem depicts the ideal of love, like Savitri. Depicts the ideal of love, like Savitri. As you know, Sri Aurobindo had written the longest book of poems called Savitri, which was written in 1954. And the poet dreams that The poet dreams that her love has freed her from beloved from death. Her love has freed her beloved from death. This is the octave part. The sestet part reveals the hard reality. The sestet part reveals a cruel reality which forces the poet to accept that her love has not been able to mitigate, her love has not been able to solve one throw of pain. So let alone bring the beloved back from death. Love and death. The title of this poem is Love and Death. Let alone bring the beloved back from death. So the poem is modern in spirit because it refutes the ideal represented by Savitri. Savitri Satyavanda's story, right? The story of Savitri and Satyavan. So let alone bring the beloved back to death. So here the poem is modern spirit, and here the poet refutes the ideal represented by Savitri. And in the story, you will recall that Savitri manages to win back life for her dead husband Satyavan. This is the story you might have heard from mythology. And Sarojini Naidu's poems makes an interesting comparison with Taru Datta's Sita poem with Sri Aurobindo's Savitri. Like all other sonnets, good sonnets, this poem, Love and Death, contains a debate, contains an argument. The debate is between the certain idea of love, right? This certain idea of love, which means love conquers all odds. Love wins over all odds, even it triumphs over death. This is the idea. And the speaker imagines that her love gives her beloved the matchless dowry of immortality. She dreams that her love has ransomed him from death itself, like Savitri, right, had saved Satyavan. So this is how the poem goes on. There is another poem called The Old Man, which was written by Sri Aurobindo. The Old Man. This is another fine poem from the same book called The Bird of Time,
Sir, Sir Sri Aurobindo na
where the
Sarojini
old
Naidu?
man, this Sri Aurobindo, na? It is Sri Aurobindo. We have already discussed Sarojini Naidu, or we have discussed, actually, the old woman is perhaps, no, this is Sarojini Naidu. Again, I'm sorry, this is Sarojini Naidu. We shall discuss Sarojini Naidu's another poem called The Old Woman. And the name of the poem is The Old Woman, which has been taken from The Bird of Time. The bird, B-I-R, the bird of time. And the poem evokes compassion, which means karuna, daya. The old man evokes compassion, and there is a refrain, which is the first article of faith for a Muslim who works very effectively, right? And Sarojini Naidu gives us a kind of history of the old man. how she was once a wife and a mother, and how she is now reduced to begging in the street. This is what has been described in the first stanza. And the second stanza is perhaps one of the most realistic pieces that Sarojini Naidu has ever written. There is no ornamentation, there is no use of jargons. But what we see here are confronting reality with, with sober and gaze. And each stanza consists of 14 lines, the last four constituting the refrain. Each stanza consists of 14 lines, and with the last four lines constituting the refrain, and there is a blend of Arabic into the English. And this is a very fine example of code mixing, Arabic and English, through quotations. And the other 8 lines in almost each stanza have the rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme like A B A A, B C C, D E E D. So the quintessence of, if you sum up both Sri Aurobindo and
Sir,
Sarojini
A
Naidu,
B
this
A
event,
B
this
A A B C.
uh, A B A A B A B A A B C C D E E D. Right? So the essence of Sri Aurobindo's poetry is the duality of self that he highlights. I mean, the body and the mind duality he highlights. The physical urges the body to remain bound, limited, whereas the other being, right, fasting for higher things, desiring for something higher things, which we have already discussed. And Sri Aurobindo, in his poetry, reconciles both life and death in his profound utterances. Life only is death. Life only is. Death is life disguised. This is what he says. He sums up in his poetry. Uh, the epitome of Sri Aurobindo's poetry is the mantra or the poetic chant. So far as form and content of Sri Aurobindo poetry is concerned, it is like a prayer because most of the poems deals with spiritual subjects. If you talk about again the first collection of Sarojini Naidu of this block, The Golden Threshold, obviously the title is very significant, The Golden Threshold, and it hints at the kind of romanticism Sarojini Naidu practiced. As I said earlier, she gave her home the same name too. She gave her home the same name, even shifting the name when she shifted residence, when she changed her house. So the question arises, what is the book a threshold to? Does it refer to a key theme in the collection? Is it regarding growing up, bidding goodbye to one's dreams, and of maturing person or woman? Or is it a threshold of a poetic career? The Golden Threshold, the name of the book of poems. Is it the threshold to our poetic career? So a long list of questions come to our mind. Mm, in a sense, we can say, as a nationalist poet, Sarojin Naidu would want to introduce our readers not to earthen India, right, but a magnificent golden India embellished via imagination and carefully ornamented. So, at any rate, the title foregrounds the problem of representation, which is at the heart of Sarojin Naidu's poetic projects. And the next poets for discussion are your Nissim Escail and Kamala Das. You must have heard these two names who are very famous for their writing style. Nissim Escail was born in 1924 in Bombay in a Bene Israel family. Nissim Escail. She belongs to the Jewish people. Right? He studied English literature at Wilson College, Bombay, did his BA and MA degree. Then he went on to read philosophy in University of London. After completing his graduation and post-graduation, he went on to read philosophy in the University of London. And after his return to India without taking a degree, he served, he perhaps he didn't complete the degree over there. He served as an editor with several journals and magazines, including your Quest, Poetry India, Quest, Poetry India, right? And the Illustrated Weekly. You might have heard the name, the Illustrated Weekly, a political magazine. The Indian Pen, P.E.N. So after a short stints in journalism, spending a few years in journalism, in advertising, in broadcasting, he taught for several years at at a college, Mithibai College in Bombay. And then he started teaching in University of Bombay, Department of English. He retired as a professor of English, Mr. Mescale, right? Wrote regular column on art for the Times of India. Besides being a pioneer in modern Indian English poetry, he is a pioneer. Nissim Scale has discovered, encouraged, and published several of India's English poets. He is a translator, a playwright, a reviewer, and his impact, Nissim Scale's impact on the Indian English literary scene is therefore considered to be very significant. So far as this poetic career is concerned, we are discussing about poetic career. So far as his poetic career is concerned, he has published 7 volumes of poetry. 7 volumes of poetry. A Time to Change and Other Poems. A Time to Change and Other Poems. This book was published in 1952. Next book, 60 Poems, which was published in 1953, right? And the third, And the fourth, The Unfinished Man. The Unfinished Man was published in 1960. The exact name, quote unquote, Themes in Darkness, quote unquote, Latter day Psalms, another book published in 1986, and his collected poems were published in 1989. Nissim Esquel won the Sahitya Academy Award in 1983 for Latter day Psalms. LATTE, letter hyphen day, DAY, Psalms, PSALMS, and has been honored with the title Padma Shri in 1988, one of the highest civilian awards, Padma Shri. Padma Shri, Padma Bhushan, Padma Vibhushan. So he was honored with Padma Shri Award in 1988. Nissim Esquel has often been called the father of modern Indian English poetry. Right? Nissim Esquel's book called The Unfinished Man, which I have already told, Unfinished Man, which was published in 1960, and The Exact Name, another book, which was published in 1965. These two books, The Unfinished Man and The Exact Name, have some of his best poems, or contains some of his best poems. Though he doesn't attempt a long poem as such, there are sequences of shorter poems, as in the collection called Latter Day Psalms, Hymns in Darkness, quote unquote. Nissim also wrote a number of Indian poems in English, the only one to use Indian English for poetic effect. As, right? And some of these poems are words of criticism. And they also show the poet's listening scales sympathy for the objects of satire. There is a poem called Enterprise, Enterprise, Enterprise. There is another poem called Poet, Lover, and Bird Watcher. Poet, Lover, Bird Watcher. The poem Enterprise is a poem of 36 lines in 6 stanzas. It is a poem of 36 lines in 3 stanzas of 5 lines each. And this poem Enterprise is taken from The Unfinished Man, the collection of books. And the dominant rhyming pattern here in this poem Enterprise is iambic tetrameter with the rhyme scheme of A B A A B A B A A B, and at the same time you can say Nissim Esquel is committed to certain poetic values. What are those values? He is committed to certain poetic values. That means we find regularity, orderliness of form, clarity of thought, and at the same time, precision of diction in his poetry. If you just remember T.S. Eliot's Journey of the Magi, this poem is about the inevitable disillusionment which greets the confusion, which greets the conclusion of any grand enterprise. When we talk about the word enterprise, the title of the poem, what does it mean? What does it refer to? Or what enterprise is being referred to here in this poem? It seems to me that the word has a vast symbolic potential. It could refer to something as broad as the independence of India, freedom of India. Or you can say it could be a critique of romantic idealism. So this is how the poem progresses. Um, like other poems, there is a lack of clarity regarding the plot of the poem in this poem called Enterprise. Here, who are these people? Where are they going? What is their goal? Such questions are not answered precisely. But enough or but enough information is provided, to give us a sense of what they are all about. The next poem called Poet, Lover, Bird Watcher. Poet, Lover, Bird Watcher. This is also a poem of 20 lines in two stanzas. 20 lines poem with two stanzas. And this poem is taken from the book called The Exact Name. Poet, Lover, Bird Watcher. It is a popular poem. It is most studied. And one of the reason for its popularity is it outlines a sort of poetic credo. The message of the poem is very clear. What is the message? That the best poets wait for words. The best poets wait for words. This is the message of the poem. But this waiting is very simple. The poet cannot, well, away his time, but like the careful bird watcher, has to remain ever alert. And there is the eternal vigil, constant watch. That is the price for the gift of poetry. So the whole meaning of the poem is enhanced, is elaborated, right, through certain comparisons with bird watching. And that is also another element that is introduced here in this poem, and that of love making, courtship, bird watching. Right? The attitude that is recommended is a very passive alertness, not of anxiety, right, or hyperactivity. The more one is agitated, the less one gains. The one who is loved is not chased like a quail, but was with such intensity that she risks surrendering. This is how the poem progresses. There is another poem called Background Casually. Right? And we have another poet called Kamla Das. Kamla Das was born in Kerala in 1934. Her mother was a well-known poet, a writer in Malayalam. And Kamala spent her several years in Calcutta, where she went to Catholic schools. She also spent some years in boarding schools too. And she began writing early, published her first poems in the Indian Pale, quote unquote, Indian Pale, Kamala Das. She started publishing her articles, poems in the Illustrated Weekly of India. Her collections include Summer in Calcutta, which was published in 1965. The second, The Descendants, quote unquote, which was published in 1967. The Old Playhouse and Other Poems, which was published in 1973. Right? And the first volume of her collected poems, published in 1984, won her the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1985. Besides poetry, she also writes short stories, some of which were collected in the book called The Doll for the Child, Prostitute and Other Stories and Novels. There are two of the two latter known as Manas, which was published in 1975. Second, Alphabet of the Lust, which was published in 1976. And she had also written an autobiography, which became controversial later on. And the name of the autobiography was My Story, and that was published in 1974. So when you talk about Kamala Das poetry, there is no doubt that her poems are accounts of personal experiences, her own personal experiences. We find some confessional elements in her poems. More than these confessional elements, it is the frankness of her verse, it is the frankness of her poems that shocked, attract, even attracted the readers. Kamala Das writes about, right, her sexual frustration and desire. She writes about the suffocation of an arranged marriage called loveless marriage. This is what she finds suffocation. She writes about numerous affairs of futility of lost of the same SHAME. She writes about the sorrow of not finding love after repeated attempts. She writes about loneliness. She writes about neurosis. Right? So she has taken up a variety of subjects for his poetry. So you can say her poetry speaks not only of her personal distress, but of her outrage against the social norms of a patriarchal society. Kamala Das was featured in the Time magazine, right? She was featured in Time magazine for breaking the sexual barrier. Bruce King speaks about Kamala Das. The Kamala Das poetry evokes or spokes fantasies, right? Many lovers and the continuing disappointment for love. And equally important is Kamala Das' experimentation with language. That she began to use English language not in the ironic and comic manner in which Nissim Escail did, but she made use of English very naturally. So though she returned from England, she had no qualms about using a language which she was comfortable and familiar with. Um, she has also written some poems which have been introduced since we have out of we're already out of time. Some poems like an introduction, My Grandmother's House, The Sunshine Cat. All these poems have been introduced. Hope you will try to say cover all these poems, right? But in a nutshell, you can say um, that Kamala Das poem, An Introduction, is a loosely structured poem of 59 lines, and this poem has been taken from the book of poems called Summer in Calcutta. There is no visible rhyme scheme, nor is Kamala Das using meter consistently. There is no use of consistent meters. Line breaks are dictated in the poem by natural pauses, breaks in the meaning, and there is a certain disjointedness in this poem, which makes it more conversational, which makes the poem more immediate. Uh, in particular, in Kamala Das' poetry, the distance between the poet and poetry is collapsed. So we find some sort of a confessional elements in the poetry of Kamala Das. When we talk about the Sunshine Cat, this is an extremely powerful poem of 22 lines from the same collection known as Summer in Calcutta. And this poem is about the decline, the disintegration of a woman. And the protagonist, the main character, seems to have suffered from a nervous breakdown. She is abused, she is locked up in a room, and is finally reduced to being a cold hand, half dead woman. The poem continues like this. And you have another poem called My Grandmother's House. This is a well-known poem, again from somewhere in Calcutta, speaks of what we might call, or it is a poem about the childhood of the poet, the security of a grandmother's house, but the self of the poet attains some sort of integrity. In that sense, it refers to a time before the rupture, the dislocation that we have seen so vividly described in the previous poems. And you have also been assigned with some other poems like K.K. Ramanujan, Arun Kolatkar, and Jain Mahapatra. Jain Mahapatra, who recently passed away, is an Odia, famous English poet. And you have also uh, Poets like R. Parthasarathi and Keki and Dhariwal. These are the poets whom you can say read by yourself. And time is over now. We can say we have only just one class tomorrow. We will finish everything by tomorrow.